In 1943, when the night skies over Germany burned with tracer fire and searchlights, and death waited in the crosshairs of unseen radar operators, one Royal Air Force pilot decided to fight the Reich's technology with something that didn't belong anywhere near a bomber cockpit, a roll of kitchen tinfoil. To understand why that single act would change the course of the air war, you have to see what British crews faced every night. The Germans had built a network of electronic eyes that covered Europe, from Denmark to the Alps, a lattice of Freya and Würzburg radar stations feeding data into the Luftwaffe's control rooms, where operators tracked incoming bombers like beads on a string. They called the system Himmelbett, the canopy bed, because once you were under it, you rarely got out alive. It worked like this. A Freya set detected the bombers at long range. Würzburg radar then guided night fighters into position, and within minutes, Messerschmitts were carving through the bomber stream, their 20mm cannons turning four-engine giants into falling torches. Every raid became a calculated massacre. Bomber Command's losses reached 20% on some nights, unsustainable numbers that made even hardened men flinch when the briefing officer pointed at the map. And yet, in a small operations hut at RAF Linton-on-Use, a quiet, wiry man named Flight Lieutenant Peter Stevens was studying radar diagrams instead of his own mission orders. Before the war, Stevens had been an electrical engineer at Marconi, designing antennas for coastal defense. He understood something most pilots didn't. Radar wasn't magic. It was just radio waves, energy that could be bent, reflected, confused. Somewhere in that knowledge, a seed of defiance took root. The British scientists at Malvern had already experimented with a concept they called window, thin strips of aluminum foil cut to half the wavelength of German radar, scattered from aircraft to create clouds of false echoes. On paper, it worked perfectly. In practice, no one dared use it. The Air Ministry feared that once the trick was revealed, the Luftwaffe would imitate it, and Britain's own radars, those protecting convoys, cities, and coastlines, would be blinded in return. For 2 years, the project sat classified and dormant, locked behind bureaucratic caution while aircrews died nightly. Stevens, who'd read the restricted memos while attached to an engineering detachment earlier in the war, couldn't let it go. Every time he saw another squadron's losses pinned to the notice board, another 20 names marked missing, he thought of those metal strips gathering dust. He knew the math. A strip of foil 25 centimeters long would reflect radar waves at roughly 560 megahertz, the exact frequency of the German Würzburg set. It wasn't theory. It was geometry. All that was missing was someone reckless enough to test it in combat. So in late May 1943, before a raid on Duisburg, Stevens went to the mess kitchen and asked the cook for leftover foil from ration packaging. The man handed him a roll meant for sealing food tins. Stevens took it back to his quarters, cut it into hundreds of narrow strips using his pocket knife, then packed them into a canvas navigation bag. No official authorization, no scientific supervision. Just intuition and anger sharpened into action. That night, his Lancaster bomber lifted from the runway at dusk, the 4 Merlin engines drumming beneath the wings, the crew unaware their pilot was about to gamble all their lives on physics. Over the North Sea, the radio crackled with the usual warnings. German radar active near the Dutch coast. At 21,000 feet, the first searchlights probed the clouds. Stevens told his navigator, "When I say drop, dump everything in that bag through the flare chute." The man looked confused, but obeyed. As they crossed into enemy airspace, the radar warning receiver began to chatter, a sure sign that Freya stations had locked on. Stevens counted to 5 and gave the order. The navigator pulled open the bag and let the metallic confetti stream into the slipstream. Thousands of silver slivers spiraled into the darkness, tumbling through the moonlight like snow. Down below, in a German control bunker outside Münster, radar operators suddenly gasped. Their screens, normally showing a handful of bright dots moving steadily west to east, exploded into static brilliance, dozens, then hundreds of echoes appearing where none had been. The operators adjusted gain knobs, recentered their scopes, cursed in disbelief. The controller demanded altitude reports from interceptors already airborne, but they had nothing. The sky was empty. The Freya plots no longer matched the Würzburg data. Within minutes, The entire Himmelbett grid collapsed into confusion. One operator later recalled that it looked as if the bombers had multiplied like fish in a pond, struck by a stone. Stevens didn't know any of that at the time, but he felt the difference. No searchlights locked on, no night fighters appeared on the radar detector. They reached Duisburg, dropped their payload precisely on the target, and turned for home without a single interception. When they landed, ground crews stared at the untouched fuselage in disbelief. Every other squadron that night had taken hits. His aircraft had none. Stevens logged the mission as navigation test, no enemy contact, then went straight to the intelligence office. The debriefing officer listened, skeptical, until reports began arriving from other crews. Sections of the bomber stream near Stevens's position had passed unmolested, while others elsewhere were mauled. Coincidence? Maybe. But by the second test, the pattern was undeniable. Stevens had flown into the most dangerous sky in Europe, carrying nothing more lethal than foil. And the Luftwaffe had missed him entirely. Word reached Bomber Command's chief scientist, Sir Robert Watson Watt, within 48 hours. Experiments at Malvern resumed at breakneck speed. Within weeks, Window was reapproved for operational use under the highest secrecy. On the night of July 24, 1943, the opening strike of Operation Gomorrah, Hamburg, saw 791 bombers each equipped with packets of foil. Over the North Sea, they began releasing them in measured intervals. German radar screens bloomed white. The operators, trained to track formations with pinpoint precision, now stared at chaos. One ground controller later testified that it looked as if angels were dancing in the sky. Fighters scrambled blindly, chasing phantom echoes. Searchlight crews swept empty air. The first bombs fell on Hamburg unopposed, igniting a firestorm so intense it created its own wind. It was horrific but militarily decisive. The Luftwaffe's radar shield, the pride of German engineering, had been rendered useless by a trick so simple it seemed like a joke. For the next 3 nights, the nightmare continued. German technicians worked frantically, adjusting frequencies, shortening pulse lengths, trying to filter the echoes. Nothing worked. Their equipment was too analog, too rigid, designed for a predictable signal. Window created randomness, and radar hates randomness. By the 4th raid, morale in the control centers had collapsed. One officer scribbled in his logbook, "We are blind. They come and go as they wish." The Luftwaffe eventually developed countermeasures, but by then Britain had gained months of breathing room, and thousands of airmen who would have died in flame made it home alive. Stevens never sought fame. In his post-raid debrief, he simply explained what he'd done, expecting punishment for unauthorized experimentation. Instead, the group commander told him quietly, "You may have just saved more men than any ace in the service." Yet the official records credit only the scientists, a decision Stevens never contested. To him, the victory belonged to every crew that lived another night, because radar could no longer find them. What fascinated engineers later was the deeper lesson his gamble revealed. Innovation doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from a cold cockpit, from a man who's tired of watching friends vanish into fire, from someone who understands that the difference between recklessness and genius is whether it works. The physics behind Window were elegant. Radar measures distance by timing how long it takes a pulse to bounce off a target and return. The strength of that echo depends on the size of the reflecting surface compared to the radar's wavelength. A strip of metal cut to exactly half that wavelength acts as a perfect resonant dipole. It reflects almost all the energy back. Drop thousands into the air and you create a false storm of targets. The radar can't distinguish between one aircraft and 1,000. To the human eye, it looks like snow. To a night fighter pilot relying on ground control, it feels like blindness. Stevens had stumbled into electromagnetic warfare before it even had a name. The Germans eventually realized what was happening. Within a month, they introduced Dupel, their own version of chaff. But by then, the balance of the air war had already shifted. Allied bombers could approach with far less interference, and British scientists, now confident, began experimenting with other electronic tricks, spoof transmitters, jammers, decoys. It was the birth of counter-radar tactics that would shape warfare for the next century. Modern stealth aircraft still rely on the same principles Stevens demonstrated that night. Control what the enemy's radar sees, and you control the battle. When the war ended, Stevens returned to engineering. He never talked publicly about his unauthorized experiment, and his service records mention nothing beyond commendation for technical initiative. He died in 1981, largely forgotten, until a historian researching early electronic warfare found his logbooks in a museum archive. The entry from May 23, 1943 reads simply, "Dropped experimental foil load, results satisfactory." Behind those words lies one of the quietest revolutions in aviation history, the moment a single pilot used scrap metal to blind an empire. It's easy to imagine him that night, alone at 22,000 feet, watching those silver flakes fall and vanish in the dark, not knowing that below him, an entire enemy defense network was losing its mind. That's the irony of progress in war. It rarely comes from generals or laboratories, but from men who decide that rules written in peacetime don't survive contact with necessity. Peter Stevens wasn't the first to think that way, and he wouldn't be the last, but for a few hours in 1943, he proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the sky isn't fire or steel. It's the courage to open a bag of tinfoil and let it go.